A Russian scholar and Associate Professor of Slavic Studies at Brown University. And here with us in our Washington, D.C. bureau is Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer. He's a retired U.S. intelligence officer and currently a senior fellow with the London Center on Policy Research. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Tony, U.S. Defense Secretary Ashton Carter has accused Russia of, quote, pouring gasoline on the fire. Now, we know that both Russia and the United States recognize that they have a problem. Right. In Syria. They both recognize the risks and dangers posed by Islamic State. Can they agree on anything on how to deal with this problem?
No, I don't think so. And I'm actually in the Vladimir Putin camp regarding the fact that as much as I think it's a slap in the face, he understands something that we continue to fail to do. We have to stop Syria from becoming ungoverned space. The bottom line is this. ISIS thrives wherever there's ungoverned space. Anywhere that there's, Libya, Iraq, all these areas where they've been very successful has to do with the fact that there's no governance there to push back against them. So as we've destabilized Syria through any number of actions we've taken, we've allowed for ISIS to thrive. It's very simple. This is binary. Either you're beating ISIS or you're not. We've not been beating ISIS. So the Russians and Putin rolling in, I think actually, as much as it is disdainful to certain folks in the Pentagon, actually helps us long-term with our own interests there. I think Putin even recognizes that. So at this point in time, we have to go about, I think, understanding that we may not appreciate how the Russians are doing it, but they're doing something we should have done a year ago. We should have been hitting command and control centers of ISIS like they're doing. We should have gone about trying to restabilize Syria. And put aside for a moment if Assad stays or goes. That is clearly not the primary issue we'd be dealing with. We should all be focused on defeating ISIS.
Vladimir, there seems to be, if one reads the press in the United States, two schools of thought on why Vladimir Putin is doing what he's doing. One is that it's a brilliant tactical move. He's caught the United States on the back foot. The other is that he is acting out of desperation in a country whose economy is faltering, where he's got a problem. What is his motivation for getting involved in Syria?
Well, I remember there was one great German statesman, Bismarck, who said that Russia is never as weak as some people imagine it, nor is as strong as some people imagine it. So I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think, to return to the question whether Russia and U.S. see face-to-face, they don't. Russia perceives a lot of U.S. actions as an attempt to squeeze them out of their legitimate areas of interest, their areas of security. Russia had a very strong presence in the Middle East. Since 1970s, it's been withdrawing. Recently, they withdrew from the influence area in Libya due to American aggressive policy. So Russia feels now, especially after they've been pushed around in Ukraine and felt that they have to protect there, that they need to defend their interests, they need to support their allies, whatever they have. So that's definitely an interest of Putin. But he also, it was a successful strategic move because he realized that this is a weak point. When he was getting involved in Ukraine, American line was Ukraine is doing democracy and Putin is a tyrant or something. But it's obvious that in Syria, ISIS is not an institution that builds democracy. It's tyrannical, cutthroat regime. So Putin used this opportunity to support his ally Assad and, attack ISIS, which U.S. was kind of unwilling or unable to do. So that's, I think, his policy.
Tony, yes. The Syrian President Bashar al-Assad did an interview with Iranian television in which he said that the US-led airstrikes against Islamic State has only helped spread terrorism in the Middle East. It hasn't done what the US was planning to do to, as you pointed out, stop ISIS, defeat ISIS. Let's take a listen to what he said.
Sure.
It is not possible for countries who support terrorism to fight it. This is the reality of the Western coalition. That is why in a year and a few months we saw no results. We see contrary results. Terrorism broadens in geographical terms, but also the number of members of these terrorist organizations is increasing.
I was talking to a close colleague who's been following this issue on drive-in just now, and secretly, I do believe President Obama wanted to play both ends against the middle, and this is what I think they were trying to do. They wanted to put up a good show, against ISIS, say that, we're doing things to defeat them. Obviously, cooking the intelligence books of Central Command, I find that story totally true, based on my own sources. At the same time, he wants to destabilize President Assad. So he's trying to do both. He's trying to, and you can't, when you try to do both, you end up doing nothing. So I think President Assad is correct by the fact that the effort against ISIS is actually, I think, presented them with opportunities. Every time we show weakness, they use that as propaganda to increase their drive for new members. It really has done that. At the same time, we have not done a successful job of pushing Assad out. And so you see Vladimir Putin recognizing this weakness, as your other guest said. Absolutely, this is an advantage. I disagree. I don't believe that the United States has been pushing Russia around. I think both countries have their own interests. And I think President Obama has not recognized one key element of Russian thought. The Russians have always felt what's ours is ours and what's yours is negotiable. And I think that's what we're seeing here, kind of a re-emergence of that very philosophy by Putin.
Well, Vladimir, the United States has questioned Russia's assertion that it's targeting only Islamic militants in Syria. Let's listen to what President Obama had to say about that.
But what was very clear, and regardless of what Mr. Putin said, was that he doesn't distinguish between ISIL and a moderate Sunni opposition that wants to see Mr. Assad go. From their perspective, they're all terrorists. And that's a recipe for disaster. And it's one that I reject.
Vladimir, do you agree that the Russian policy in Syria right now is a recipe for disaster?
No, I don't think it's a recipe of disaster. And I think the statement of President is not based on much. Unfortunately, this moderate opposition, part of it is probably somewhere in Turkey, part of it is non-existent, part of it was supported by CIA to a great disaster, because they themselves acknowledge that they either exaggerate the amount of this moderate opposition, or whoever we try to help, they would sell their arms and run away. So I don't think there is much of opposition left right there. So I think it's embarrassing that President even mentions them, especially at this stage of the game. Maybe 4 years ago they were there. But now I don't think there's much of them left. They're more or less squeezed between a rock and a hard place. So I think what Putin is saying and doing is more or less make some sense within the circumstances. He said, let's support the legitimate government which fights ISIS, and then we'll figure out what's in store. But this talk about some moderate, non-existent moderate is a little bit either naive or disingenuous. That's how I see it.
Tony, what are your thoughts? President Obama is saying, well, hit ISIS, hit them hard, but leave the moderate opposition alone because they will become the ultimate government.
Well, we've talked right here and on about this about a year ago. I stated right here in this very spot how insane the idea was. We're going to train moderate Islamic radicals to go against this folk, because obviously I predicted they would take the training, they would take the arms, and they would defect to the other side, which they've done. So I agree with Vladimir here. He's correct, completely correct. We did see the inevitable results of a bad policy. And let's be clear on this. General Austin, the commander of Central Command, said 2 weeks ago in front of Congress that out of $500 million, out of the investment of trying to do this, we have 4 or 5 guys trained to do this. Think about that. Think about the number of millions of dollars per individual. And they're completely ineffective because ISIS numbers are in the thousands. You're not going to have 5 guys. This is not like a Marvel comic where you can train 5 guys and send Captain America in to lead them. So we've got to understand that the policy has failed. President Obama continues to refuse to accept that his policy has failed. And this is where I think, again, Putin's rolling in, the Russians are rolling in to do what we should have done a year ago.
Vladimir, is the Russian policy totally about making sure that President Assad stays in power no matter what?
I think I would put it a little bit differently. I think a regional U.S. policy was to make sure that President Assad falls. And that was a misguided policy which more or less generated the emergence of ISIS in all its strength. So it's confusion. I think, of course, Putin is vested in Assad. He sells him arms, and he wouldn't mind staying in it, but I don't think he would mind sort of see eventually some other government. But what they want is stability in the area and their presence. And I think that's his main interest. So as long as whoever is there in power, if they work with Russia and recognize their interest, I think Putin will be happy.
Tony, if the goal is stability, is the United States making a mistake by insisting all the time that Bashar al-Assad must go?
The United States, I'm speaking as the corporate we, not Tony Shaffer or London Center we, the United States, made the assessment that Arab Spring was a good thing, that basically bringing freedom to everybody in the Middle East was a good idea. Pretty early on, that went down the pipes. It turned out to not be true. But unfortunately for the world and for the Russians, that belief is still being held by the White House, that somehow Arab Spring was the right thing to do. So what we now see is the instability created by Arab Spring perpetuating itself by this bad policy. So yes, the answer is, I think we have to recognize that again, I hate to say it again, but ungoverned space, the idea that governments which are legitimate are falling, is part of what's creating the instability. We've seen it in Yemen, we've seen it in Libya, we've seen it now in Iraq and in Syria. So we've got to step away from this concept that all these cultures are ready for democracy. They're not. And so the idea that we're just going to open it up and let them be free opens up the potential for al-Qaeda, for ISIS, for other extremist groups to come in and fill that vacuum. So at this point in time, the White House is completely wrong. President Obama is completely wrong. There's no room here for any other than that the policy is not working, it's not going to work, and it's time we rethink it. And again, I'd like to believe that maybe the Russians taking the lead here, pushing this issue, will actually bring some sanity back to the White House, because at this point, there's no clear thinking on it.
Vladimir, sometimes, we know that actions have unintended consequences. Could the Russian intervention in Syria result in there being now a bigger rift between the United States and Russia?
No doubt about that. Basically, I do think that there is still, all these events have some kind of a aura of proxy wars. Because what should be stressed that by its involvement in Ukrainian crisis, U.S. really provoked Russia. Russia, when U.S. Was interfering in Yugoslavia in '99, Russia was too weak to respond, although they felt it as a tremendous threat to their allies, to other friends. Well, they swallowed it. Instead of just settling on it, U.S. continues to push Russia, continues to interfere. It was Georgian war in 2008. Russia felt it, it's their front yard, don't mess around with us. No, U.S. continued. They continued in Ukraine. So my feeling is that they walked into this hornet nest in a double sense. One hornet nest is in the Middle East, which needs a much more subtle approach. And another hornet nest is they provoked Russia into sort of taking action. So wherever Russia would feel now that there is a weak spot, they will try to assert themselves.